I used to always wake up in high school.
Many know him as the host of MSNBC's Morning Joe. But before his rise to fame on the political talk show, Joe Scarborough first made a name for himself in Northwest Florida as the Republican candidate who came from obscurity in 1994 to win a seat in Congress. 20 years later, he recently celebrated that win with family, friends, and former campaign supporters. They gathered for a backyard barbecue at his parents' Pensacola home.
And we're just so thankful and honored that y'all helped out then and that you came back here 20 years later. It means the world to us. Thanks a lot.
Scarborough's brother George remembers when he decided to run.
He was not a McLean fan, and he wanted to try to make a difference. So he had a message and a gift, a God-given gift to deliver the message, and he worked about 20 hours a day. So he just was driven to be successful, and it's paid off very well for him.
Sister Carolyn says her little brother was always an overachiever.
When he was decided to run for Congress, everybody was like, well, don't you just want to be a city councilman or a mayor or something like that? He says, no, I don't want to change the roads. I want to change government.
Escambia election supervisor and Scarborough's former chief of staff, David Stafford, remembers meeting him on the campaign trail.
As you know, he's a very charming, personable guy. He's really easy to talk to, and someone like me, I guess I was 20, in my early 20s at the time. It was not like your typical distance between you and a politician running for Congress, and so we hit it off.
At the time, no one had ever heard of Joe Scarborough. Former State Representative Lois Benson was favored to win at the time.
The folks in Tallahassee, the powers that be, thinking that the other individual, Lois, was going to take the race, and he would call me and say, "Hey, what's going on over there? We're starting to hear a little bit about this Scarborough guy." I said, "Well, it's there's a lot of people talking about it. The race is going to be a lot closer than people think."
Bright and charismatic, Scarborough was also relentless on the campaign trail.
No one wants to lose. Certainly, you don't go into something like that, and I thought I would be good, and I think I would have been good. But he represented the spirit of this district at the time. And
the win wasn't a huge surprise to his family, who say he's always been competitive and passionate about three things: music, sports, and history.
My mom, she had her master's in music, and we were always playing music, piano or guitars or something in the house. So that was, music is a real deep love of ours because our mom has really put that into us.
I mean, he loved music growing up. I'll never forget when he was a teenager. When I'm out playing football or whatever with my friends, he was locked up in his room listening to Casey Kasem's American Top 40. He would videotape and play it back. So he had a real passion for music.
In fact, Scarborough had a band in the early 90s that he flew to New York City in hopes of winning a recording contract. Ross Orenstein played keyboard.
Joe, before his previous life, wanted to be a rock and roll star. So he asked me to go play in his band in New York City. We played at CBGB's about 23 years ago. We were doing a showcase at the time for a record company. I don't even know if they showed up that night, but they say it's a showcase for a record company. And Joe's quite a musician. He's quite the songwriter.
Scarborough wrote a musical in college, among other activities. He was admitted into the Florida bar in 1991 and practiced law in Pensacola. In 1993, Scarborough briefly represented Michael Griffin, the man accused of shooting and killing abortion doctor David Gunn. He remained in the public eye with his efforts to fight a hefty property tax increase in the city. The momentum helped propel him into the 1994 congressional campaign to replace 8-term Democratic incumbent Earl Hutto, who was retiring. Opponents and supporters alike say Scarborough's conservative message of less government and more personal responsibility hit home with voters in Northwest Florida and across the country.
He tapped into the mood of this community and of the country. He is a very, very effective campaigner, so I would never underestimate him.
In front of a crowd and an audience, I think he really is, he has a message that resonates, and I think that's why he was able to come out of nowhere in 1994 with no money, just a message and an ability to deliver the message and hard work and a lot of volunteers that believed in it.
At the time he was elected, Scarborough was part of the so-called Republican Revolution. He was one of about 40 freshman Republican legislators voted into office who called for sweeping cuts in the federal government.
He had a grasp of the issues. A lot of times people try to fake it, and clearly I think what came through with Joe, one of the things you saw when people talked to him, and even up in, I think one of the other things I remember about him up in Washington, some things that that drove other people crazy about him was that he would reach across the aisle on issues where he had some agreement, and they were not your typical issues, and work with people in the other party, and he seemed to like and respect him.
He quickly became a star among the new legislators and was tapped by Newt Gingrich to head a Republican task force on education. Scarborough supported conservative issues like the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, as well as efforts to cut government spending, like voting against a minimum wage hike. But he was moderate on environmental and human rights issues.
There's this caricature of him as this, right-wing conservative Republican, which certainly, in his core is what it is, but he certainly on differing issues, environmental issues and whatnot, he was kind of all over the map on some of that stuff, and so that made it exciting.
And the guitar playing, it continued in Washington, even at the Republican National Convention.
One of the fun parts was, I don't think there's probably too many other staff members who would work during the day and studying legislation and trying to help get things done, and then at night go play rock and roll music. So I was filled in as drummer a couple of times for him. We recorded music and stuff like that. So that was really fun.
But it all ended in 2001, when 5 months into his fourth term, Scarborough abruptly resigned, saying he needed to spend more time with his children. Northwest Florida voters were forced to head to the polls for a special election to replace him. He addressed that at the 20th anniversary celebration.
When I had to come home, I didn't exactly come home the way I wanted to come home. But I always told people getting out of Congress was the hardest decision I ever made in my life professionally. But it was the easiest decision I ever made personally.